Bom, vou resumir aqui, vou chamar novamente.
So I will brief. I invite to this table one more time the order. Professor Patricia Howard, she apologized. She's not going to open up her camera because of the internet connection. Professor André Magalhães, Newton Barbosa, Fabiano Silva, and Professor Daniel Rosa. Welcome to this roundtable discussion.
Bem, obrigado a todos.
Thank you so much, says Fabiano, Gabriela, and all the other participants, professors, doctors. Thank you so much for the invitation and congratulate for this event. I have been following since day one, and it's been really gratifying and exciting to see this topic of invasive species. It was so diversified, bringing different technologies, work fronts. Specifically, I work with this topic since 2004. And in the beginning, with the golden mussel specifically, we had so many questions, basic questions of biology, of the organism, how we could handle it if there is a specific problem, and how much we have evolved, not only with that species, specifically the golden mussel, its biology, its ecology, but also different techniques and equipment and research, the understanding in the ecosystem, what it happens in the ecosystem that they invade, and also different organisms that interact. So it's really interesting when we compare the history of this forum, different topics that we have seen, and it's so nice, and I feel honored to be part of this discussion now here. Good morning, everybody. I am, like Fabiano, I feel honored to be here at this table. I have been following this event since day one. And it's interesting, you know, really interesting. I realized today that this event, the work we perform, all the discussions that we have on invasive species, the innovation they bring to us in our adaptation process, and the golden mussel here in South America. When we can see something like this, we open up our mind to different discussions that we can have here today. That's it. If the other speakers would you like to introduce themselves and say something, go ahead. Your audio is muted, Professor Andrea. Hi, everybody. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to give you a hug. All the best. All the speakers, all the participants as well. And let's see this roundtable discussion. I can talk about bioecology, ecology on the internet.
Então, tema bem interessante, né? Ainda embrionário no Brasil, precisa trabalhar mais com isso. E um abraço especial aí a duas pessoas aqui, o Daniel, que me convidou, participei da banca de doutorado dele, um abração, e o Newton, foi colega meu de doutorado, colega meu também na UNA.
Colleague na UNA, a hug for you all. And that's it, I'm here for you. I'm here at your service to clarify whatever you need about the ecology on the internet. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to give a hug to Professor André. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation with valuable information, innovative information. And we can go ahead, I believe, with the questions and the roundtable discussion. What about it, Gabi? Excellent. And I would like to invite Professor Patricia Howard for her initial considerations. Professor, can you open up your microphone. Is it okay with you?
Yes, I believe that I am speaking now, if everyone can hear. I just wanted also to add my thanks for the invitation to participate in this forum, which I must say I've been really amazed at. I'm amazed at the profound knowledge, as others have acknowledged, that's being developed in Brazil, and how many new ideas, really innovative ideas, how the cutting edge of knowledge, research, technology is being stimulated and brought in and adopted and developed in Brazil, and how I keep thinking about how little is known in those countries of the world where invasive species science and technology and management is very largely concentrated, like the United States, Australia, and Europe, etc. How little is known about what's going on in South America, and how very often what's going on in South America is misinterpreted or misunderstood. So I think that having a conference like this, and especially having a conference like this and making accessible, not only in Portuguese, but as well in English, perhaps other languages, and to an international audience is not only laudable, but it should definitely be imitated and these kinds of efforts reproduced. So I congratulate you very heartily on this.
Professor Patricia, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. It's an interesting, very amazing topic of research, and it's our pleasure to have you here. Thanks for taking time to send your talk, which was very enlightening, and thank you very much for being here with us. We really appreciate it.
Eu posso começar fazendo alguns comentários?
If I may start with some comments, Patricia. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I was wondered by your topics, your presentation. This is connected to what we have been discussing lately in the attempt to understand this process better in a holistic way, not only biological bias. And you mentioned about the case of Prosopis. Here in Brazil, we also have Prosopis introduced. It's called algaroba in some places. It's a very common plant in the Northeast Brazil. And the examples that you have given us about it, Prosopis juliflora in Ethiopia, if I'm not wrong, I do not remember, they are so similar to the ones that we have in Northeast Brazil. That region is dry, semi-dry region, semi-arid. A few years ago, Fabiano and I, that's here with us, we visited the Northeast to find gold mussels, and it was a time of drought peak. And the only plants, green plants that we could see in the middle of the dry land, very dry, it was algaroba, Prosopis juliflora. And this plant nowadays has a very big importance for the local population because they are source of food for the livestock. They eat the flowers and the plants, and also for wood production because it's a big tree, so it's useful for fuel wood. In these cases, I see lots of human adaptation, how the human being used that resource to their favor. And this is, I believe, this is easier to see. The species that is non-native has value to us human beings. But in the case of golden mussel, I have a hard time, I'm having a real hard time. It's hard to live outside the box, you know, thinking about everything you mentioned. But in case of invasive species that do not have value to us human beings, like the golden mussel, we do not eat it, we do not use it. We try in our group to find out uses and innovation using biotechnology to use these animals, but we do not have something straightforward like algaroba, like prosopis. For people in the Northeast, it's a source of energy for them, cheap and fast. Also food for the animals. In this case, there is, I believe, I would like to hear from you. There are two groups of species, non-native species, in this case, in this context, in this idea that you brought to us. The ones that have commercial value and the ones do not have commercial value. The ones that do not have value and they cause ecological impact, economical impact. How should we see our pathway, our adaptation to these invasive processes?
Thank you for your most interesting question, and also for the example of the prosopis in the northeast of Brazil. I did not know that prosopis was an invasive species in that region, but I can very well imagine that it's arrived. I think that it's fairly easy to talk about two different kinds of species, one that's useful and one that's not. One that's beneficial or potentially to human and one that's not. It's actually not so straightforward. And the reason it's not so straightforward is I think that you will find if people actually went and did some more in-depth investigation of prosopis spread in Brazil, they would find there are both harms and benefits. For example, prosopis can be very harmful to livestock because it has enormous thorns. And if it spreads and becomes too dense, which is quite possible given environmental conditions, but also what humans do when livestock are eating the seeds, they will spread it, for example. Then livestock can become trapped in the shrubs and they can become harmed and killed. They can be eaten by predators much more easily. So, well, prosopis is also known to have toxicity for livestock. So there are harms as well as benefits. So there's kind of maybe a tendency to kind of see the surface of the thing where it looks like, oh, people are enjoying this and they're using this and so forth. But if you start looking deeper, almost all the case studies we know show that benefits are very rare to find alone for these these are species that we know to be quite harmful. So people are having to adapt to both the harms and attempting where they can to make benefit, but to reduce the harms. And when people do these things, the point is they try to manage it, for example, they will change the spread of the invasive. They may change it for better. They may actually be able to restrict spread. A lot of people have used very profound local knowledge to achieve this through cultural means, for example, or their attempts to control may actually spread it. Because just like with science, we don't know what's going to happen in the future with our actions. What we think is effective right now to control the spread may actually in the future end up aggravating the conditions because we're changing ecosystems at the same time, not only individual species, but we're changing ecosystems. So the kind of uncertainty that's involved for science is also involved when people attempt to manage, adapt to, or make the use of something they can't avoid. If you can't avoid prosopis, then you've better try to bend it to your use. But the question is, what do you do with species that don't have any positive use? Well, you also have to look here, not only at the so-called commercial use, like like tilapia, or the Nile perch, or the king crab. You also have to look at ecosystem services. And there's a lot more uncertainty about what ecosystem services, what happens to ecosystem services with an invasive. I think a lot less is known, although we've heard that there's research going on about ecosystems with the golden mussel. What's happening with fish, for example? Is this something where we're going to see over time that the changes that are occurring in trophic relationships and food webs that are related with the golden mussel are actually going to diminish the impact of the golden mussel or have other more profound effects on fish populations and on the ecology of aquatic systems. The suggestion was made by Boltovsky when I contacted him that he knows at least of one case where the numbers of fish have increased so much that fish catch has doubled. And when fish catches go from 10,000 kilos or, whatever the measure, I don't know what it was, to 20,000 in a short space of time, and people are catching those fish and incorporating them into their livelihoods. Well, those are impacts that, are they related to the golden mussel or not? And then what are the kind of knock-on effects if people start actually harvesting much greater fish biomass from the aquatic areas? Well, those are all things that the only way we could try to get a grasp on is to understand the ecosystem service changes, those ecosystemic changes, as well as the social and economic that might accompany them, for example, through modeling, to try to get an idea of what are some of the potential alternative pathways. So when we intervene, of course, that's the idea, is take it up a little bit higher level, try to look at ecosystem services, ecosystem processes, and then get a grasp on how the social and the economic might be interrelated with those things. So that's, I'm sorry that I've gone on for so long, but it's trying to relate it to your question most directly, as I know how.
Sim, obrigado, Patrícia.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Patricia. In fact, this shows us the importance of studying in invasive species in all its biases, all its strengths, negatives and also positive aspects. I believe there is a bias scientific trend, naturally, it is not total, but some scientific trend. We always try to show negative impacts of invasive species. And most of the times, the scientists, we forget to analyze the positive aspects, the interrelationship, the social interrelationship of humans and the species, because in the end of the day, all the human societies for the last billions of years, they were successful in establishing, settling themselves, and the success was introducing invasive species, non-native species in the world, domestic animals and plants. We see lettuce and we imagine that it's native all over the globe, but it's not a native plant in South America. So, thank you so much for your considerations. I do agree with you that this shows the importance of research, basic, fundamental research, intermediate, and of course advanced research for the negative and positive aspects of all these species. And I would like to bring up a point to this discussion. And it's important to bear in mind that the biological invasions, they are disturbances in the systems, like different disturbances. And these disturbances, they vary on time and space. So, as well as the society adapts, the human society adapts to these disturbances, learning how to use in different fronts, commercial use, food, also as tools, different tools, bio-inspiration, as we see in this forum as well. The environment adjusts itself. Danielle's work is interesting to see most of these invasives become exclusive source of food in some invaded environments that suffer disturbances in the past, like reservoir formation, any other impact like effluent water, reducing the diversity and the density of organisms. And these invasives occupy that site. So just comparing to the process, evolutive process in the ecology, we see some organisms, some invasives as adaptation process. The different organisms adapt to that invasive.
Também da gente
And this is an important point to consider also in the management techniques, because we know there is ecological succession. I do not mean there is not an impact, that is not negative, but it's important to consider this disturbance in time and space and how it worked
mesmo,
for
né,
succession of a certain
diferentes
within this context, different impacts that they are inserted.
Eu achei bem interessante a questão, fazendo paralelo.
So interesting and
O professor André
to
até tem uma pergunta aqui mencionando
there is
isso.
a question about it here.
Invasões
We have some news of invasions. Professor André cannot hear Gabriela. Can you test and see if Professor André, can you hear us, Professor André?
Só o meu?
O seu áudio está fechado.
Eu não estou ouvindo o áudio da Gabriela.
André cannot hear Gabriela. Can you hear me now, André? Gabriela is speaking. I cannot hear her. Professor André cannot hear Gabriela.
Eu consigo ouvir a Gabriela.
I can hear her. Fabiano can hear Gabriela. Okay, tracing a parallel. Professor André cannot hear Gabriela, but people in the chat said that can hear her. Maybe we can help you somehow. Invasive cases, we only have the news much later when we have a qualified team in the field detecting. And this technique that Professor André presents, we have a possibility that is interesting about. Professor André, are you in the English channel? Professor André, can you hear me in English?
André,
Oi, eu não ouvi o que...
André, I did not hear Gabriela. Yes, she's asking you if your translation button is on. Let me see. Yes, it is. It's off. Put in Portuguese now. Let's try it now. Now my translation. Yes, now I can hear you. Great, great. Professor, you mentioned you are presenting a new method depending on the social network, so we can identify new species. And I believe that most of the species would only be reported at a point that is late after the invasion. So in this sense, I think that it's important to notice that these new techniques will bring a new possibility of studying this environment, how they adjust, and eventually recovering previous moments of this invasion. In previous episodes, when there was an increase of fish or any other species, we can relate this to the point of invasion. We know that it's so important to understand the moment of the invasion, if there was a meaningful peak in that species. And on top of that, we have collaborative base, base.cb.org, to follow up the dispersion of golden mussel. And in your presentation, we have a new pathway to expand these to other species and other methods as well to monitor this kind of invasion. So, if you would like to say something, I thank you so much for this new technology, for this new idea that you have brought. Yes, one of the roles of the researchers is to bring something new, to scientific world, and if possible, for society. How? It is something that we need to do more often. How can I say? Building a bridge between the academia and civil society. And this bridge, as far as I see it, is not so nice. Would you like to see one example? This denial attitude in Brazil, it means that the civil society, lots of people do not know that we have scientific research in Brazil. So it's up to us, scientists, to convey new information to the academia with scientific article publications, congresses, and also this bridge to the civil society. How? Publications, for example, in Ciência Hoje, Science Today. So if I publish this data that I have, that I am researching about bioinvasions in the magazine, Biological Invasion magazine, something to reflect. Probably 20,000 people globally will read my article. But if I publish this article in Portuguese, in accessible language for lay people in a scientific magazine, very popular one in Brazil, that is Ciência Hoje, Science Today, probably my work would be read by 1 million people. So stop and think about it. The academia somehow is restricted, but when you go and you make science for scientific dissemination for lay people, the reach is higher. So we have to reflect on it. We have to reflect on it right now, immediately. So one of the objectives of this study is to bring something new and show there are several possibilities. You can study the introduction to space and time, ethology, as I mentioned in my presentation, density, populational density. You can also study ecological iterations. There are several topics that you can study in the ecology on the internet. You need to be a specialist, invite colleagues in your expertise area or even other areas. And I do believe that through the ecology in the internet, we can have scientific research, top quality one, without needing to go to the field. This does not mean that we should not go to the field anymore. No, the field is very important for classes, ecology classes. It's important the student to be on the field to realize what's going on there. But ecology on the internet helps us at sites and places. At this point, I cannot go to the Northeast for a research insight with fish in certain sites. I cannot. In this period of pandemic, I cannot go. And even after the pandemic, because of the circumstances of budget, and also traveling to places that are not accessible, they are remote, I believe the ecology of the internet can help us a lot, a lot. We need to know how to use your data. For example, if you want to publish an article about videos, you need ethical aspects, anonymous, everything about the owner of the YouTube channel, and you can do it. But if you do not use videos, if you use data of relative frequency, absolute frequency, different pieces of data, you publish as an article, as if you were in the field. So there are several possibilities, and they are really interesting.
In the first day of the event, during the roundtable I was participating, you mentioned the human swarm robotics, and I think after watching Professor André's talk, I think that might have been a way to implement it, the human swarm for checking on, for identifying new invasions, new biological invasions. How do you see the communities dealing with the biological invasions? Is it, do you think of any way to include them in the step of identifying new species? How do you see that? Professor, I think your audio is off. It's closed.
Sorry, who are you asking?
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can certainly hear you, but I don't know who you're asking the question of.
To you. Oh, sorry, I think it was probably the audio in the very beginning. So I was thinking, did you hear the part about a human swarm?
Yes, I did. And that was a comment that I had when you were discussing the swarm robotics, which was absolutely fascinating, because I think that bringing these two discussions together, the one about using social networking and the one about using robotic swarms, is, of course, what are the function of humans as possible swarm robots. And I don't like to characterize humans as robots, nor do they like to characterize themselves, because the AI that humans have is of course, beyond anything that we have computationally. Nevertheless, of course, certainly in Europe, in the United States, the idea of citizen science has now developed very strongly over several decades, and it was a very new phenomenon just 2 decades ago, and it's become extremely important in terms of climate change and biodiversity and being able to track the phenology of species, the movements of species. Spring break, bud break, all kinds of things. It's also being used a lot to track what's happening with insects and bird diversity and how these are changing so very, very rapidly. And of course, it's done through apps and social media, largely. Not like the tools that you've been discussing about harvesting this data from the internet. And I'm already advising people in IPBES and the Global Assessment to look into this, what you're talking about, as a potentially extremely important tool. But human beings are very comparable to swarms in the sense of that you were presenting a framework for looking at the swarms. And I was thinking about all of the characteristics, and virtually humans who are acting as citizen scientists or monitors or observers are behaving in very similar ways. And I thought it could even be interesting to bring that framework that's being used in robotics to inform and help with the organization of citizen science monitoring. What you have in Brazil that we don't have as much in Western Europe, of course, is you have much deeper reservoirs of local knowledge, because the people, many of the people who are living in the spaces that you're interested in monitoring have much more profound knowledge about ecosystems and ecosystem relationships and the relationships between species and species behaviors that they themselves observe and understand, and they can inform us, as a matter of fact, where our own scientific knowledge can be limited. They can certainly inform us in terms of hypotheses. In the fields of ethnobotany and ethnobiology, which are the fields of science that actually study this kind of local knowledge and understanding, we're very aware that local knowledge, especially traditional knowledge or local knowledge of people who have lived for a long time in these environments, subsist from them, depend on them, is a very important input into science, and can be used for ground truthing as well as monitoring, but also for the development of hypotheses and trying to understand the dynamics of change over time. So all of those things are very interesting, and I think it could be quite useful to try to bring together some of the insights from both sides to look not only at the thing about humans being kind of, robots collecting data, but also because they can bring intelligence and information into that process, and they can be networked. You can draw upon people's interest as well, their own motivations to participate. And different people, different groups of people who have very different motivations to participate. But I'm sure you have experiences. I know that you have a lot of experiences in Brazil. There's the Brazilian Society for Ethnobiology, which is full of people who basically are specialized in looking at these things. Anyway, I think it's really a very stimulating idea to say, well, we still don't have robots on the shelf. Humans can be perhaps a cheaper way to achieve some of the same things, as you are very well exploring. Sometimes they'll even give up secrets like they do on the internet.
Eu posso fazer... desculpa, pode fazer.
I'm sorry, I would like to have a recommendation. It's interesting, as I said in the beginning, the environmental problem, biological invasions, they are present in different technologies. We have worked with models, modeling in CBA. We have worked with the tools, ecological tools, mathematics, statistics, now tools in the computers for scientific use. And the techniques, molecular techniques, we had a day about it. And now artificial intelligence. This topic is so fashionable, so present. I have a recommendation. There is a book just translated in the end of the year to Portuguese. Professor Max Terdi-Markner from the University of Massachusetts. There are 0 points. He is one of the precursors of artificial intelligence and gather different thinkers, the skeptical ones and also the pessimist and the optimist ones. And he traces a nice relationship in his book. And I could not connect the invasive species in this context. And it's interesting, and I recommend that you do read his book. I try to trace a parallel to that you mentioned, the citizen science. That is an amazing tool, not so well used by us here in Brazil. And I believe it's recent as well, the use of cell phone, mobile phones, people use it, it's growing and growing, and it's so nice. But one of the concerns, technical concerns that I have about this work is about the taxonomic rigor. And then I ask you, Andrea, a question. During his presentation, I saw a specific point when you mentioned the introduction of the Amazon turtle. And there in your slide, there was the species Botonimis infilis. And to me, it seems so similar to Podonemis stances. They are similar species. Sometimes we have to analyze their DNA to tell them apart. And my concern is, in case of the work, when we collect data from the social network, about the taxonomic rigor that could cause confusion and generate low reliable results. How do you see this? How can we adjust this problem? Yes, you're right. When you work like this, you need to, if you publish this work, you have to, especially when you have illustration, you have to select a video, a picture, an image that clarifies the species, characterize the species. For example, in the article that I published in Journal of Applied Geology that I showed in my presentation, this publication in 2021, you could clearly see when you zoom in the frame of the video zoom in the video, that the species of Ostronautas is Crassipinis according to the morphology, body morphology, and you could see clearly the spikes of the dorsal flap of Oscar Astronautus ocellatus is different from Astronautus crassipilis. So you need a good picture, a good image. If you try to publish with a bad image, probably it's not accepted, because one of the revisers would say that possibly the taxonomy that the researcher is trying to show of that species is not reliable. And then these two species of Tracajá, Uniphilis, the young ones, they have spots, yellow spots, typical spots. This was a young animal, and it's getting bigger. So the young ones bring yellow spots. The other species, the spots are orange. They have different characteristics. I could also see on the flaps, how can I say, the plaques in the shell, there are differences. You have to be demanding and rigorous in order to publish this work. And what you mean is valid, exactly, it's valid. But the DNA aspect, we needed to collect. There's no other way collecting DNA in order to investigate, to analyze. There's no other way based on morphologic characteristic, external morphologic characteristic of the animals. The fish that I showed, Oscar, and also the example of Tracajá. For example, Tracajá, when it gets bigger, adult, the yellow spots are opaque, they lose their bright. And the young ones, no, it's bright yellow spots. And the other species is bright orange, bright reddish. But what you mentioned is important. If you place a bad image, a bad illustration, you do not get published. Sometimes the image where the yellow turns orange, then the orange turns yellow. Yes, this happens. I get images of a video of a coral introduced in Salvador, Bahia. And we have to be rigorous with the image. This coral is blue, you know, light blue, bright blue, was introduced by aquarium dumping. But there is another video of a diver showing, but we could see that the camera is bad. And the environment gets bluish all over, and you get confused. Other coral could be blue as well. You need to be rigorous, of course, because there are cameras that has a very good image, but other cameras can be not so good image variation. If you deal with photography and if you film, a variation of image could be different in the morning, in the afternoon, or in the dawn of the day. Yes, you have to be rigorous in order to publish. If you get a video of an animal, there is a video of Lauro de Freitas in Bahia that he fished a sarapó fish, very long fish, they call it sarapó, tuvira, gymnotide, it's another family of a gymnotide. He caught in that region, and this fish, the video was awful. The cell phone camera was awful, bad camera in the cell phone. So I saw that is in the Amazon animal, but I cannot publish this video because the video is bad quality. You see? I can have another type of study considering that video and comparing it with pictures of the same species and showing that the Amazon animal introduced in Joanes Basin area, the metropolitan area of Salvador is Joanes River. So Amazon animal introducing that region, but the video is poor quality.
Could I also
But
mention something?
I have my expertise. It's the Amazon animal. It's not native. When I got in the internet, you see, it's an animal from the Amazon introduced in Salvador, probably introduced by aquarium dumping because they are used in aquarium. That's wonderful, Andrea. I have another kind of question now. And talk about sometimes there are problems with no solutions, no technical solutions to help us. And then I see Patricia's presentation. I see that most of the problems that we have, adaptation problems, do not have a technical solution. There are some solutions that have to do with change of paradigm, change of ideas. And then there is an example in Brazil about African grassland. I do not know if Patricia knows about this problem. The grassland, African grassland, was introduced in South America as food for cattle. Hundreds of years, these species come here, braquiária, grassland, all these species of grassland. The important characteristics, they have volume, they are bulky, more than the native grass that we have in Brazil, in savanna areas in Brazil. And thinking in a Darwinian way, Patricia, the adaptation is not always, does not follow a pathway of improvement, but transformation always, adaptation to changes. What I see in Brazil, especially in the savanna area, we have big areas of invaded by these African grassland areas that are there in the surrounding of livestock. They spread our parks that we have near Belo Horizonte. We have a park called Park Rosa that is totally covered by these species of grass. And this species has a very used to us. In the rural area, all the land stands for the livestock use these grassland that are exotic, non-native, they are invasive. Thinking about this case, to say that the adaptation, human, economic aspect that is really strong. But in Brazil, we do not have support from the government so we can control these species in protected areas. And there is no, that's why I mentioned, because the solutions are not technological. They come from ideas, they come from thought. There is no idea. If you go anywhere in Brazil and ask people, what do you think about grassland? They do not have an opinion that is bad for them. No, it's bad. People are adjusting to it. Hundreds of years this grassland has been here. People accept that grassland, that site, in a positive way. And what we see, there is consequences introducing this grassland in native areas. The first consequence, it's considered transformation effect in the savanna. The fires are higher, increased fire. There are plants that change their phenotype because of this the transformation during fire. I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Patricia. Also in this case, and the adaptation is not following necessarily an improvement pathway, but it's accepted. Disturbances are accepted as part of the world where people live.
I thank you for your observations because they're extremely important. When I talk about adaptation to invasive species, I've been focusing, generally speaking, on fairly small scale areas. I think the invasion of prosopis in the Afar region is one of the larger scale processes that we've been able to document, thanks to the fact that there's so many different researchers in Ethiopia who've been looking at this and doing work on it over time. There's probably about 40 different case studies that have been published, not only looking at the ecological processes, but the social, ecological, economic processes. But if you look at the drivers of this invasion in the Afar, they're much more higher scale drivers. They're talking about government coming in and deciding it's going to expand agro-industry. Why is the government doing that? Why come into an area which has been occupied by indigenous pastoralists for thousands of years and say, we're going to take your land and we're going to put big agro-industries there. And we're going to start producing crops for export, and then inviting foreign companies to come in and do the same. It's called development. There's politics and economics that are involved in these drivers, just as the same in climate change. And these drivers are international, and they influence people at all levels. And when we look at how people respond to invasive species or to climate change or to deforestation, we know that there's people who are interested in promoting those things because it fulfills their economic goals, for example, and we know that there are people who are badly affected. So the distribution of costs and benefits of these things is a major factor. The distribution of costs and benefits. And unfortunately, when it comes to the distribution of environmental costs, it's very uneven. So you find very often the poorest or the smallest, the smallholders, the small fisher folk, et cetera, are bearing the brunt of negative costs, whereas large international corporations are bearing the brunt of the benefits, or aquaculture industries or trade. Those who are promoting that. So when you look at the drivers of species invasion across the globe, many of those drivers are fundamental economic drivers. But there's also people who are trying to move around the world through tourism, for example, go to visit exotic places. And when they do those things, they unknowingly introduce invasive species. So we know IPBES is now going to engage in a new global assessment. And it's on transformation. And they haven't started it. They were asked by 130 governments to look at how can we transform human environment relations on this planet so that these global level drivers, these extremely important economic drivers, social drivers, begin to change. And we begin to adapt to the fact that we're destroying biodiversity and we're ruining the climate. And no matter how many, when I used to work for the FAO, and we would talk about projects, for example, to stop deforestation. And we'd end up coming up with little tiny islands of success in seas of deforestation that were happening all around. So you can affect the very small local area, but what are you doing about the overall processes? You can't affect those. So this is something that is absolutely requisite. I did not say that adaptation was something that was overall positive. I tried to show that you have different results of different adaptation strategies and processes at different levels. So even things that are positive for local adaptation can have negative effects overall if you scale those things up. It's really hard because then you have kind of a message that says, oh, well, all of our efforts, at the local level to try to make things better are going to just be overwhelmed by what's going on at a higher scale because the governments are going in the opposite direction or something. But I don't think that that is definitely at all the messages that we bring away. Because to tell you the truth, it's scientists like yourselves that are driving the demand and the need and the awareness that we have to transform. We have to get somewhere different. And not only that, but if we ever are to have a reasonable way to manage the Earth's resources and our biodiversity and human well-being, it's going to be through the kinds of methods, understandings, tools, communication, etc., that you're developing. It doesn't come out of nowhere. So all of these efforts are absolutely positive, but I think that we need more interdisciplinarity. We do need to be thinking across these scales. And even if nobody's putting their money or energy into it, we need to be at the very forefront of create better social ecological understanding and more demand for sustainability. That's the only thing that I can say to you. And I very much understand your concerns and your cries. They're very real.
Interessante, Patrícia, que a gente vê o quanto...
Interesting, Patricia. We see the connection of everything, the importance of what we see today, this loss of people. People are dying. People do not like nature anymore. They are not close to nature anymore. They do not value biodiversity. People who live in the big urban areas, they see themselves so far away from nature, as they were made of plastic themselves. And in fact, we are inserted in this environment. So I see things so connected because we do need to stimulate in people. I always try to stimulate in my students this curiosity for nature, because the creation of these values are so hard to be created nowadays, because there is a higher force in the society that put us away far from biodiversity. To get back to have the curiosity of biodiversity, this could be back in my question. People see that grass as something that could be damage to biodiversity and value biodiversity. This is one of the hardest things that we see nowadays. When you mention the problem that people have when killing invasive animals, when I teach, I showed recently an image of goat being killed in Galapagos Islands. Goats are a problem in Galapagos Islands, and this generates emotion. They get emotional, they shake when they see the images. It's so hard and so complex because they get emotional because they love nature. The biology students, they love nature, and it's a matter that is so complex and so big and really interesting. If I may have a comment on top of what you mentioned. Yes, go ahead. I think that...
me. I'm sorry. The only thing that I would add, I think that, Newton, your observations...
De interesse pelas pessoas no mundo natural, ou seja, o meio ambiente, uma das coisas...
One of the things that we have, I will mention this again, an abyss between the academia and the civil society. Academia is based on a tripod: teaching, researching, and extension. You are university professors here in Brazil, as I am. These three elements of the tripod, what is the easiest one? The answer is, what is? Fabiano, Newton, Gabriela? Extension, of course. These people deny in Brazil, this is one of the reasons, of course. I do not condemn our professors, colleagues, because the task of a professor at university is very hard, because you have to teach all the levels, you have to be in the meetings of department, you have to participate in administrative tasks as well. So we have field work, we have to publish articles. Not easy to publish an article, isn't it, Newton, Fabiano? It's not easy to publish articles. It's a handful and time-consuming. So where do we find time for extension? We have to think about it. If CNPq provides productivity scholarship for extension, shouldn't we have candidates for extension with a scholarship? Of course. You see what I mean? It's obvious. We need people studying because they are against the academia. How? When we see this wave of denial that we see the public in Brazil, that's what I mean. We have to think about it and reflect immediately. It's about time to reflect on it, to value more extension, university extension, because university extension, you bridge with the civil society. One of the things that could be useful, CNPq create productivity scholarship specific for extension, university, scientific use. Of course, we are having colleagues interested in this extension course to achieve a scholarship based on productivity. There are alternatives. So we break this barrier of communication, scientific dissemination, and the civil society.
Perdão, professor André, eu gostaria só de...
Professor André, I'd like to interrupt because Professor Patricia would like to say something in the beginning. As we have a delay of the translation, we have problems. Professor Patricia, please go ahead with your comment.
Thank you, but I very much appreciate André's intervention in this sense. And I think that your emphasis on communication is extremely important, because if we do have the power to influence, but unfortunately, like you said, we don't often have the time or the resources. It's not where the universities put their incentives for us. So it does become very difficult. It's something we have to do in addition to what we're attempting to do. But if scientists weren't doing this, if they weren't engaging in fora like IFPES, if they weren't involved, then all of this momentum we have to stop climate change wouldn't be there. So it's an extremely important part of our work. And I think in countries like Brazil, especially, it's also extremely important to counter denialism, the mistrust of science and so forth, especially in an era that you have like now. And it can be even problematic, I realize that. Some people could jeopardize their jobs because they're vocal, because they come out, because they're critical. But what I did want to say about the grassland is my knowledge of grasslands comes from my own 10-year PhD research on cattle ranching expansion in Central America. So I looked at the process of cattle ranching expansion and deforestation in Nicaragua and in Honduras. And they lost as much forest land proportionately as has been lost in Brazil. My professor is Susanna Hecht, who was the person who brought the problem of Amazonian ecosystems, deforestation, conversion to pasture to the world's attention, looking at the ecosystemic processes that occurred of degradation as you remove forests and replace them with pastures that often became degraded over time, and you ended up with brush encroachment. So this problem of nutrient loss, et cetera, with deforestation was very important. But when I looked at the process of pasture expansion that I saw in Central America, I saw a very violent process. It wasn't that people simply started putting livestock on the land happily and gaining income from this. it was a process where smallholders were very often pushed off of their land. Their labor was used to deforest, and they were forced further and further away. And after deforesting, they'd be forced to sow pasture grasses so that larger cattle ranchers could come in, take over that land, and basically monopolize those resources. And because there was a problem of degradation that would occur 3 or 4 years after cattle were put onto the land, more land would have to be deforested. So there was a violent process, and many, many peasants, campesinos, were forced off the land, forced further into the forest to deforest, and pushed off to urban areas because there's no employment involved in cattle ranching. You use one person per 50 hectares or 100 hectares or even 400 hectares of land. There's no jobs created by it. But if I wanted to understand why this was happening, I had to look at world markets for beef. I had to look at the World Bank financing these things. I had to understand why it was that cattle ranching was generating gold for people, while the value of the resources was zero, considered as zero. Now, if you want to look at people's appreciation of grassland, you have to look at their dependence on grassland. What do? Humans become dependent on particular biological resources for their survival, for their livelihood, for their income. And I'm afraid that no matter how much you try to educate them that the grasses are bad, if that is their primary wealth, is the grass, they're going to defend that. So the only thing that you can do in that instance is like saying, well, university education is bad, all the professors are out tomorrow. The only thing that you can do is change the drivers. That's the problem. You have to go upscale. You have to stop the incentive for deforestation, for putting cattle on land where they do not belong, for converting resources, and then for allowing invasion process. There are positive examples of restoration as well. You can restore grasslands. But then you have to ask, who is going to benefit from that? Who's going to have the incentive to do that? And how can you support that? Those are the bigger questions that we need to be asking, because we can try to educate people out of their interest, but that is very unlikely to happen.
Esse é o ponto muito importante, né?
That's the point. Really important. Educate people out of their interest. And this interest was created how and when? Something that we can visualize is the importance of give the proper attention to the human condition. The degradation of the human condition is a factor that will make it possible people to extract something so they can survive. We see that this is one of the factors today that enable the pandemics, for example, 2 factors, the destruction and the degradation of humanity in the regions of Asia. The pandemic comes up. So there is, as a veterinarian, I know a big group of veterinarians that created an idea called One Health in veterinary to integrate the animal medicine, the animal study, the human health, and the environment, because everything is integrated. And these factors, human health, human condition, the governments can improve somehow, granting it somehow. These factors are drivers of biological invasion. So this topic is so complex, we can talk about it for hours, all day long. Professor Patricia, I would like to bring up a point. I think it's very important in this discussion. And then I think it's our role when we develop good indicators to talk to the society, to show them indicators that make this reading of the system, but also communicate different listeners. When maybe if you work with this topic, it's simple to understand that disturbance provoke diseases, unbalance, and these have a cost for the society. Economically speaking, there is a cost. The future of that land, for example, for crop use or not, maybe it hinders the ecosystem in that area, in that environment. And that's a problem that we have to solve internally, to work with good indicators that we can convey with different stakeholders, people. And then I believe this idea of measuring the ecosystem is interesting. Why? We can show the value of the rivers, flying rivers, people talk in the newspaper, the importance of preserving the Amazon so we have water. Also, it's all important to not introduce a species so we still have the river flowing of depuration and serving fish to people, quality water to people. And let me say something. That is a very interesting question to Patricia from Hugo. He's asking that how can we reach a consensus between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge? What I mean is, what do we call knowledge in the end of the day?
I don't consider myself particularly qualified to answer that question. I think it's a wonderful question for the entire panel, but I think that Fabiano has raised a very good point. Is it knowledge if it's kind of like saying, if a tree falls in a wood, does it make sound? So if there's scientific knowledge, it goes nowhere. Does it have an impact? And I think this whole question that we keep raising, one of communication, is that communication needs to be a multi-way street, not a one-way street, but one way also that scientists, I think, can improve their communications by listening. And listening to people who aren't scientists, trying to understand their perspectives, their knowledge, because everyone has some knowledge. It's difficult, of course, to call it, the same as scientific knowledge, but it doesn't mean it's invalid. And so getting more multi-way communication, how many times do we actually ask the people who are managing the grasslands, what do they think about it? What's their interest in it? Are they willing to trade it off for something else? What other things are important to them? How do they see the processes that they've been confronting over decades? And would they change something? If they could change it, how could science help or be involved in a process? So I think this is one thing that it's very interesting, because I've been working over the last 2 years with 70 different scientists on the IPBES global assessment on invasive alien species. And what you see over time is kind of an evolution of thinking among the scientists. Most of us start out in a kind of little silo, all right, our own little universe where we're very tied up with whatever very specific topic we're working on. And we're not thinking about that bigger picture. But of course, with COVID, for example, One Health is now going to be in our assessment. Health is not, human health is not something in a lot of invasive alien species people work on. They kind of see it as outside because we deal with nature and native species and all of this. But they begin to see, well, wait a minute, our science is much more relevant. And we may have tools that could be used, but we can learn from the rest, because we need to start seeing these as integral dynamic systems. And humans are involved, and human interests and well-being are important in those systems. And when you start to do that, you start to look at more integrated approaches. And then when we get to the whole part of knowledge and communication, we start seeing really the need, not just for educating people. That's a one-way flow. It's we know, you don't, we're giving it to you. No, it's a much more dynamic process. And it's a process of working on the problems that we have on the planet and that people have. So anyway, that's the only thing that I can say, but I'm sure every one of you has a lot to contribute to that kind of a, to talking about that kind of a question. And to tell you the truth, I think in many, many ways, it is going to take the voices from the South to be able to put things on a better track across the world. I don't think you can rely on leadership necessarily coming from other places. There's some really nice publications coming that have been coming out of Argentina about how invasive sciences, how researchers in invasive science want to be more responsive to the real problems they have in their own countries rather than chasing the elusive publication goals established by the North in theoretical invasion biology, for example. So there's some really good work going on there saying we have maybe other priorities. And, but that's a question. It's who drives us? I'm sorry.
Deixa só complementar aqui a...
Let me complement Hugo's question. The knowledge, scientific knowledge, is a way of seeking knowledge. We have the modern science, Western science, as we call it, 300 years old. For example, how things are connected. Curare was the first muscular relaxing for surgery. Curare was used by the Indians in the Amazon for years and years to hunt. So they found out this. The initial knowledge of curare came from them, but it exists in a commercial way. It's used in surgeries. It's a muscle neural blocker. Human knowledge, we can see trials and errors, also in a structured way using science, modern science.
Acho que a gente pode...
I believe we can. Yes, I thought that Professor Patricia would say something. No, but it was my audio. So we are moving towards the end of this discussion. Very sadly, we need Professor Patricia in 3 more editions of this forum so she can talk more. Extensive work with a very big team of researchers. And I thank you so much, Professor André, Professor Newton, Professor Fabiano, Professor Daniel, my colleagues, and especially highlight Professor Patricia Howard, that was nice enough of accepting the invitation to come to this panel and the other days of the event as well. It was so nice to have you here with us, Professor. And do you have a question? Would you like to say something briefly in this end of discussion? I would like to say something very briefly.
It's been my great pleasure, and I have learned so much from listening to the presentations and seeing them. Thank you so much for having them online in English. You really broadened my perspectives and made me realize how much I still have to learn from all of you. And all I can say is that I hope that we have some kind of opportunity to continue collaboration in the future, because I find you a tremendously stimulating, intelligent and interesting group of people. And I know how hard you're working to make some progress. And not only with the golden mussel, but more generally in Brazil, and hopefully to bring your voices even more clearly to the rest of the world.
Não, é só falar que...
I would like to say that there is extension work in the universities in Brazil, but they are not enough. They are in the early stages. What I mean is that we need more this extension work. Somehow, scholarship based on productivity for researchers or any other scholarship, or a special session to increase CNPq, CAPES, to motivate and incentivize the extension more accessible, more affordable for the lay people in Brazil. This would be it. And I would like to have a final consideration. When I see everything in this discussion, I see the importance to us in our studies of biological invasion, associate it and consider the human sphere. I cannot ever not thinking of invasive species without thinking about this idea of human being in the surrounding. This is essential. The humanity, since its beginning, transfers species here and there, use them all, and it's impossible not to think about this human factor and realize, and I thank Patricia for that. Since when we invited her, I saw the articles, I read her articles, the importance to realize that we are studying the golden mussel. We are part as well of this adaptation, human adaptation to this invasive that is here for some decades in South America. I thank you so much, Patricia, for the discussion and all the participants. I could be here for hours, but we cannot be here for hours. Thank you so much. I would like very briefly to thank you so much, all the participants. And it's the final panel and member of ACIBEI. I would like to congratulate all the team for the organization, the topics, the diversity of topics, and guests. So interesting. This week has been so rich and nice. And on behalf of Professor Paulo Assis, Professor Antônio Valadão, our technical coordinator, that guide us, and all the team of CIBEI, and also never forget CEMIG, on behalf of Marcela, the manager of projects, choosing these topics. You start with Maria Edith Rola a while ago. It's so nice to have this connection with the companies so we can develop research. They are sensitive to observe in a systemic way. So from a problem, environmental problem, the case of the invasive golden mussel, we can develop so many research work fronts. That's it. Thank you so much. And a hug to you all.
Eu gostaria também de agradecer.
And I would like to thank for the opportunity of participating of this discussion. The discussions were so rich. To thank Patricia, Professor André, Fabiano, Gabriela, and I apologize. People asked me some questions about my work. I will check how I can answer these questions for you. But thank you so much for the questions. Thank as well for the invitation. I was so honored. It's an honor to be here in this fourth forum. Thank you so much, Danielle, that contacted me. Nice to see you again. Newton, nice to see you again. I give you all a great hug. Professor Patricia Howard, thank you so much. Fabiano, Gabriela, I give you all a great hug. Thank you so much.